Good morning. And we are now live. It's 10 o'clock. Welcome to those of you on Zoom and on Facebook live, as well as those of you who will be listening to this later today or later this week. Lovely to have you back with us for Practical Parsha. Our topic for today is family traditions. Are we exaggerating is the question. Well, tradition is part of our Jewish way of life. Well, very familiar with the song of Fiddler on the Roof, tradition, right? That's what makes us. That's what molds us. In fact, we have the famous line where Tevye explains, or they explain the customs of wearing, our heads are covered, we wear a little prayer shawl. This shows our devotion to God. The famous line from Fiddler on the Roof. And you may ask, how did this tradition get started? Is the question. I'll tell you. I don't know, but it's a tradition, because traditions make us who we are. Everyone knows who he is, who she is, and what God expects of us to do. That's the tradition of traditions. So part of Jewish faith is certain halachot or laws. When we look into the Torah itself, we see that the Torah has mitzvot. 613 commandments are part of our mitzvot. Then we have rabbinic laws as well. And it was the role of the rabbis to give us certain laws that complement Torah law, either by way of decree or by guidelines or restrictions or limitations or ways to guide us. And that, I would say, is rabbinic law, right? So you got biblical law and you got rabbinic law. And then third of all comes customs. And certain things are customs, are traditions, which many have very authentic sources to them. They weren't necessarily laws. They weren't given to us in the Torah text by Moshe Rabbeinu. They also weren't given to us as rabbinic laws, but they were incorporated as traditions, as customs. And we know that those three categories, biblical law, rabbinic law, and minhagim or customs or traditions, are equally accepted in Jewish tradition, in Jewish observance. We don't start differentiating. Many people like to ask the question, what is this law Torah law? Is this law rabbinic law? Is this law a custom? Where did it come from? And I think it's important to remind ourselves that it's all equally, fundamentally part of Jewish life. All part of Jewish life, whether it's biblical, whether it's rabbinical, or whether it's just custom or tradition, it's all part of Jewish life. So we're here to discuss the family traditions. And when I say family traditions, our president here in South Africa, President Ramaphosa, has introduced the concept of a family chat. What does he mean by a family chat? He means a national chat. He wants to speak to the nation about where we're holding with COVID. Well, our family is not just our family. It's also our community and it's our people. So when we talk about family traditions, sometimes we do have family traditions. And it's the way my father would cut the challah at the Shabbos table, or the way my mother would prepare the challah on Friday afternoon. Those are particular family traditions. But then we have community traditions. Certain things, the way things are done in certain communities. Sometimes it's done this way, sometimes it's done that way. And each community may be different to one another. And then we have national traditions of Am Yisrael as a nation. And this is how we do things on a national level. I want to highlight specifically as part of our discussion today, some traditions that we read about in this week's Torah portion, right? In the portion of this week, which is Parsha Re'eh. So we come across certain mitzvot that are clearly documented and written in the Torah this week. And then based on that, we also have further traditions that are extrapolated from this week's Torah portion, okay? So in Parsha Re'eh, we highlight some of the festivals, some of the Yomim Tovim, that feature in this week's Parsha. And one of them is V'samachta b'chagecha. One of them is celebrating Sukkot. You and your children and your maidservants and your servants and the Leviim and the converts and the mourners and the orphans, everyone comes together to celebrate. Everyone comes together to celebrate the Festival of Sukkot. As it says, Shivat Yamim, for 7 days we celebrate Sukkot, which was a grand celebration in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, as all gatherings of all Klal Yisrael around the world would gather together and travel to Yerushalayim to celebrate this. It was a very joyful time, but we had a very interesting tradition. A very interesting tradition, which isn't documented in the wording of Torah, but it's alluded to. It's hinted to, but not documented in, and it became a tradition. When I say a tradition, it doesn't just mean that my baba or my aunt taught me about this. This is a tradition that became part of the services in the temple. What was the tradition? The tradition was that on the mizbeach, on the altar, there was 2 holes at the back of the altar. And it was in these holes that they would pour liquid as part of the sacrifice. So on top of the fire would go the animal, and then behind the animal you had these 2 little holes, and in the holes you would pour the liquid. What liquid did we pour? So generally speaking, a sacrifice was always brought together with a wine libation called nisuch hayayin. We would pour the wine onto the mizbeach, onto the altar, as part of the ceremony. But on Sukkot, there was an additional ceremony. On Sukkot, in addition to pouring wine together with the sacrifice, they also poured water. And that was called nisuch hamayim, the pouring of the water onto the altar as part of the celebration. And I call this a tradition, because it wasn't a clearly stated law in the Torah, but it's alluded to. It's definitely alluded to. The rabbis have a long way of extrapolating this from the wording of the Torah, but that custom, that tradition continues. It wasn't just the bringing of the water. Listen to what the Talmud writes about the ceremony that took place. It was full of pomp and ceremony. Each night, a massive party would take place at the temple with music and dancing, and the masses would come together. And then at dawn in the morning, the entire crowd would then go down to the pool of water where they would fill up their vessels and they would bring it to pour on the mizbeach. To the point that the Talmud says that whoever did not see the joy of Simchat Bet HaShoeva, whoever did not see that joy that was celebrated as they prepared for the water libation, because they had to draw the water and then sacrifice and pour that water on the altar itself. This happened every day of Sukkot. Whoever hasn't seen this, says the Talmud, whoever did not see Simchat Bet HaShoeva, the celebration of the drawing of water, has never seen a celebration ever. And it says that at the conclusion of the first day of this festival, the main temple courtyard would undergo significant repair. Why significant repair? Because of the crowds that would rock up. They would prepare golden candelabras were set up, each with 4 bases of gold at its top, and 4 ladders of each pole, for each pole. 4 young priests would take pitchers with the capacity of oil and pour them into each basin. They would light up lights around Yerushalayim to celebrate this. The pious men and the leaders would dance before the crowd while juggling flaming torches, and they would say passages of songs and praise. The Leviim, the Levites, would play their instruments as part of this ceremony. Where do we know this from? Well, the verse says, "Usha'avtem mayim besason mimaynei hayeshua." We actually say it in the Havdalah as well. Usha'avtem mayim besason. You should draw water with joy, with simcha. And that became a tradition. Simchat Bet HaShoeva became a tradition, the celebration of every night of Sukkot as they prepared for the water libation on the next morning. You may ask why. What was the significance behind this tradition? there is great significance there on two levels. Number one is that water and wine are very different. Wine represents taste, represents understanding. Mostly during the year, we do a wine libation because mostly during the year, we're focusing on our logic, on our intellect. And that's why we rely on the wine to be specifically used as a wine libation. But comes along Sukkot, we're actually celebrating another aspect of Judaism. We're celebrating the aspect of our deep, deep belief in Hashem, which comes with Rosh Hashanah, the day of crowning God as king. It comes with Yom Kippur, a day of atonement, and then it comes with Sukkot. And that's the water libation. The water libation, pouring water on the altar, water on the altar is celebrating water. What does water represent? Water represents no taste, no understanding, no logic. Because our Judaism is so supernatural, super logic, and that's represented by the water. And so when it comes to that moment of Sukkot that we celebrate the illogical side of Judaism, the faith and the belief of Judaism, we celebrate that. We dance and we sing as part of our celebration. You know, when it comes to dancing and singing, you don't need too much seichel to dance and sing. You don't need to be a whiz kid to get on your feet and dance. You know why? Because dancing also takes you to a level of supernatural, super logical. You know, it's the academics. For example, when we arrive to a wedding, we've always got the choice. Are we going to dance and celebrate with the wedding? Or are we going to take a step back and stay at my table and take it easy tonight? You know, it's always, halavai, we should have weddings to be able to go to. We haven't had weddings and celebrations in a long time. But when we go to a wedding, we got that dilemma. And it all depends. If I'm intellectually caught up and there's a lot on my mind, I can't let loose. I can't dance. I'm too bothered. I'm too bogged down. I'm too anxious. And there's a lot going on in my mind. But if I am above that and I'm ready to celebrate, to put aside my logic and my seichel and my worries and my anxieties, and to jump in with all my emotion into the celebration of the wedding, suddenly I let loose. That's what happened with the Nisuch Ayah and the pouring of the water libation. We let loose. And as part of that tradition, to dance all night as we pour the water on the altar, celebrating the fact that Judaism is a lot deeper than the seichel and the intellect and the logic. We have another tradition as well in this week's Parsha, in this week's Torah portion. Well, actually, this particular one is from a different Parsha, but it's related nonetheless to the festivals. So I'll touch upon it and we'll compare it. We'll compare the two, and I think there are similarities. This one is Pesach. Pesach time. So we were just speaking about Sukkot now, right? So now let's discuss Pesach time. So Pesach time, we have another offering, which was unique to Pesach, right? Something unique to Pesach was the Omer offering. And the Omer offering was a barley offering that was brought on the second night of Shavuot, of Pesach, which then began Sefirat HaOmer. So the barley offering of the Omer offering began Sefirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. It's called the counting of the Omer because of the actual sacrifice of the Omer. So here we have a similar story. There was a debate among the sages regarding these two celebrations, regarding the water libation offering of Sukkot and regarding the Omer offering of Pesach. This was a heated debate in Israel during the times of the Second Temple. Who was the debate between? There was an internal debate between members of the community. And the question was, do we actually believe in this tradition? That's the theme of today. Do we believe in the tradition of the water libation? Do we believe in the tradition of the Omer offering? Why was there even a debate about this, you may ask? Well, living at that time, there were different groups in Israel. One particular group, which changed names over time, either they were called Tzdukim, which are Sadducees, or the Baitusim. Different families had different traditions, but they shared a common one, and that was, we only believe in the written Torah. That which is documented in Torah, right, we recognize as part of our religion. But anything that's not documented in Torah explicitly is not part of our tradition. So many issues were debated. For example, tefillin. It says in tefillin, ukshatam la'ot al yadecha, right? Tie it as a sign on your hand, al yadecha. Well, does that mean my hand, my palm? This is normally called my hand. Okay? We know by tradition that the Torah is actually referring to my bicep, opposite my heart. But that's a tradition. And that's oral tradition that was passed down to us and given to us as an extrapolation or an explanation of what's written in the Torah. But they didn't believe that. They went by what was written in the Torah. And therefore, when it came to the pouring of the water libation, they argued it. Where does it come from? There's no explicit verse in the Torah in this week's Parsha that speaks about Nisuch HaMayim, the pouring of the water. It does speak about Simcha. Yes, there's joy. It does speak about the celebration of Sukkot. But where did the water idea come from? So we say the rabbis see a hint to it. There is an extrapolation. There is a hint to it in the wording of the Torah, but it's not explicitly there. We also understand spiritually what it represents. Water represents the supernatural, while wine represents the logic of Judaism. We all understand all of that, but they couldn't accept that. And they argued, and this became a debate. Do we do Nisach Hayayim? Do we pour the water libation? Do we celebrate the water libation? Why would we need to? And the same thing applies to the Omer offering on Pesach. We had the same experience with the Omer offering. There's a wording in the Omer offering which made a confusion among the different sages at the time. The wording is Mimacharat HaShabbat. You should count for yourselves 7 weeks, Mimacharat HaShabbat. And the debate became, what does Macharat HaShabbat mean? What does the morrow after the Shabbat mean in context of the Omer offering, of offering up of the sacrifice? We know that the word Macharat HaShabbat, the day after the Shabbat, means the day after Yom Tov. That means Pesach is first day, and then comes the offering of the Omer offering, the barley offering, which begins then the celebration of Pesach, but also begins the 7 weeks of counting between Pesach and Shavuot. Now, that was debated because the Baitusim at the time, the Baitusim were the ones who, again, believed, like the Tzdukim, like the Sadducees, they believed only in the written Torah. And they said, where do you get that from? Macharat HaShabbat for us means the day after Shabbos, which the day after Shabbos is Sunday. And therefore they said, we're going to celebrate this on Sunday. We're going to bring the Omer offering on Sunday because the Torah says clearly it needs to be Sunday. And once again, the debate broke. The debate began as to, do we value the traditions of Judaism? Or must we rely on the written text alone, the Torah text alone? Is that the only source that we can rely on? Or do we say that the traditions are part of us? There was one particular year when a Kohen was appointed to pour the water libation on the Mizbeach. This is during the second Beis HaMikdash. And the Romans were ruling over Israel at the time, and they appointed a Kohen to step up and perform the water libation on the Mizbeach. The problem was that the Kohen was a Sadducee. He was a Tzduki, which means he only believed in the written Torah, and this particular tradition of pouring the water libation on the altar didn't talk to him. It wasn't part of his traditions. So instead of going up to the Mizbeach, to the altar, and pouring the water into the hole on the Mizbeach, what did he do? He poured the water onto his leg. Right? Outright rebelling against our traditions. The masses who were there were furious because they were coming for an authentic experience. And now they see that the Kohen who was appointed as part of the Orthodox services here was a Sadducee. Call him reform or conservative or whatever other demographic he may have come from. He wasn't part of the Orthodox tradition, and therefore he outright rebelled. Instead of pouring the water into the hole on the Mizbeach, he poured the water onto his foot. Ever since then, they made a new tradition, a new rule, that we need to be able to see if we can trust this Kohen or not. So as the Kohen would step up to the Mizbeach, we would then ask him, raise your hand. Raise your hand, and we want to see the water. We want to see that you're part of us, that you're not hiding, and you're not going to pour the water over your foot instead of pouring it into the hole of the Mizbeach. And that also became part of our tradition. So from these two stories, and that's why, from these two stories, we see a common denominator. That's why both these events were celebrated with great joy. Both the Nisuch HaYayin, the pouring of the water libation, as well as the preparation process of the barley for the Omer offering, was also there with great fanfare. I'll read you, the Mishnah says, regarding the barley, he says, all the nearby townspeople would gather together so that the reaping would be carried out with great fanfare. Once it grew dark, he would say to the assembled, did the sun set? They would say, yes. Should I reap the sheaves with the sickle? They would say, yes. Should I place the gathered sheaves into the basket? They would say, yes. This became like a big ceremony as part of the cutting of the barley. Why? Because traditions are important. And when we were trying to celebrate the traditions of our water libation, or the tradition of the barley offering, of the Omer offering, right? Both those traditions were celebrated with great fanfare, celebration, in order to spite the Sadducees and the Baitusim. That we're not going to follow the naysayers. We're not going to follow our critics. We're not going to follow the rebellious ones who mock our traditions. On the contrary, we're going to come out in our masses, and we're going to dance, and we're going to celebrate as part of the traditions of Judaism, of Torah life. And so I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss our traditions and how important our traditions are. And when I say our traditions, I mean family traditions and community traditions. And how much it is important to us. So it's important to clarify that not all traditions are necessarily based on authentic grounds or authentic sources. Sometimes traditions are just what we call babamaises. You heard of that word before, babamaises. So our babbas, somehow created these traditions, these minhagim. Not our babbas necessarily, but the babbas out there would come up with all sorts of traditions. The famous custom where a young boy grows up at home and he sees that his mother would always cut off the ends of the fish before putting the fish into the pot, and that became the tradition. So when he got married, he said to his spouse, he said to his wife, "This is our tradition. Our tradition is we never put the full fish into the pot. You got to cut off the ends before you put the fish into the pot." His wife never heard such a thing before. What's wrong with the ends? What's wrong? You can cook a whole fish together. Why must you cut off the ends before you put the fish into the pot? That's my minhag, that's our tradition. And eventually, after they're bickering and arguing and back and forth, he goes to his spouse, to his mother to clarify. And his mother said, yeah, I never had a big enough pot to fit the whole fish in. So practically, I removed the two. I cut off the ends in order to put the fish into the pot. That's a minhag, that's a tradition. And so there are some traditions like that. And that's why it's important, not all traditions can be related as being holy. But that being said, many traditions are holy. And when they come from holy origins, whether it's our generations of old or it's rabbinic sources, they carry great weight. And often what happens is that the cynics laugh. The cynics laugh at traditions. Sometimes they got a point, but sometimes it's out of rebelliousness. What's the point? Right? Like the opening that I started with of Fiddle on the Roof and wearing of the yarmulke and wearing of the prayer shawl over our shoulders or over our heads. We often mock them. What's the tradition? No, these traditions have great depth to it. Just like the tradition of the water libation and just like the tradition of the Omer offering before Pesach or on Sukkot, so too certain traditions are part of who we are. Talking about fish, we're preparing for Rosh Hashanah now, and going to Tashlich and throwing our sins out to the fish in the water is one of our traditions. Now, many people don't get it. Like, what on earth? How's that possible? How do you throw sins into the water, to the fish? Is that fair? First of all. Second of all, is it real? Can you really throw your sins into the water? Well, that minhag, that custom goes back many, many centuries. And there's deep significance to it. And there's deep spiritual significance to it. And there's deep tradition to it. And therefore, we must be so careful not to belittle or mock or criticize a tradition, but to realize that traditions are part of who we are, not just the written text. Like the Sadducees or the Baitusim would say, that the written text of Torah, that's part of Judaism. But all the rest isn't part of Judaism. The traditions make us. They make us as a nation, they make us as a family, they make us as a community, and we can't mock them. On the contrary, we can investigate them, absolutely. We can ask questions, we can try and find the origins for it. That's important to do. And once we find those origins, and once we understand where they stem from, and who created them, and where it comes from, then it becomes part of our identity, and part of the beauty. And that's also what's so nice, is that different communities have different traditions. So different communities have different traditions, and that's what makes us so beautiful. Is that the Sardim with their traditions, and Ashkenazim, and Hasidim, and Litzvaks, and we come together so beautifully with different traditions. They shouldn't contradict one another, and they shouldn't intimidate one another. On the contrary, these traditions is what makes the beauty of Judaism and gives us our real personal identity and feel when it comes to Jewish teachings. So that's the discussion for today. Those of you on Zoom, just stay here for a moment. We'll say hello personally. And those of you who have joined us on Facebook Live, thank you for being with us. Those of you who listen later, feel free to engage, message me, contact me with any questions or comments afterwards, and have a wonderful day ahead.